You are sitting in a room full of people who care about you. Maybe it is a family gathering. Maybe it is a holiday dinner. Maybe it is just another ordinary evening. Everyone is talking. Everyone seems certain about something. Certain about life. Certain about right and wrong. Certain about what success means. Certain about what kind of person you should become. Then, without warning, a strange thought appears in the back of your mind. A thought so simple that it feels almost dangerous. What if most of what I believe about myself was never actually my own idea? The moment that question appears, something uncomfortable happens. You try to push it away. You tell yourself you are overthinking. You tell yourself everyone grows up the same way. You tell yourself that your values, fears, goals, and beliefs are simply who you are. But the question remains, what if they are not? What if many of the things you call your personality are actually instructions that were handed to you before you were old enough to question them? Think about it. Before you could read, before you could understand politics, philosophy, religion, culture, success, failure, morality, relationships, money, or identity, people were already explaining the world to you. Not because they were evil, not because they wanted to manipulate you. Most of them genuinely believed they were helping. Parents passed down what their parents passed down. Teachers repeat what they were taught. Communities preserve what helped them make sense of life. Entire societies operate through inherited assumptions. Yet somewhere inside that process lies an uncomfortable possibility. You may have spent years defending ideas that you never consciously chose. You may have spent decades chasing goals that were selected for you long before you knew what a goal was. And the strangest part is that this does not feel like deception. It feels like reality. That is what makes it so difficult to notice. The most powerful stories are not the ones people force you to believe. The most powerful stories are the ones you never realize are stories at all. Imagine a child growing up hearing the same message again and again. Be realistic. Be careful. Do not dream too big. Life is hard. People cannot be trusted. Success belongs to other people. Or maybe the opposite message. You must always win. You must always be strong. You must never fail. You must make everyone proud. Different words, different households, different cultures, yet the same result. A blueprint quietly forming before self-awareness arrives. Years later, that child becomes an adult and mistakes those internalized voices for personal truth. The fear feels personal. The ambition feels personal. The insecurity feels personal. Yet how much of it was planted long ago? If this question has ever crossed your mind, leave your perspective below. Not because there is one correct answer, but because almost everyone has experienced that strange moment when they realized part of their identity may have come from somewhere else. The uncomfortable reality is that human beings are born dependent. We learn by imitation before we learn by reasoning. We absorb before we analyze. A child does not evaluate ideas. A child inherits them. This is not a flaw. It is how survival works. But it creates a problem later. Once you become capable of independent thought, you discover that your mind is already full. Full of assumptions, full of conclusions, full of fears, full of expectations. And some of them were installed so early that questioning them feels like questioning reality itself. Have you ever noticed how two intelligent people can grow up in completely different environments and become absolutely convinced of completely different things? Both feel certain, both feel rational, both believe their perspective is obvious. Yet both were shaped by experiences they did not choose. This does not mean truth does not exist. It means human perception is more fragile than we like to admit. We often imagine ourselves as independent thinkers standing above influence. In reality, we are deeply influenced creatures who spend much of our lives discovering where those influences came from. The reason this realization creates discomfort is because certainty feels safe. The moment certainty begins to crack, anxiety enters the room. Suddenly, questions appear where answers used to be. What do I actually believe? Which fears belong to me? Which dreams belong to me? Which values came from personal reflection and which arrived through repetition? For many people, these questions remain buried because confronting them can feel like betraying family, community, tradition, or identity. Sometimes the lie is not a specific statement. Sometimes the lie is the belief that questioning itself is dangerous. Think back to moments when you sensed something did not fully make sense, but remained silent anyway. Maybe you feared conflict. Maybe you feared rejection. Maybe you feared disappointing someone you loved. Human beings have a remarkable ability to ignore doubts when belonging is at stake. The need for acceptance can become stronger than the need for truth. That is not weakness. It is human nature. Yet it also explains why so many people spend years living according to scripts they never consciously agreed to perform. There is a scene that repeats itself in countless lives. A teenager begins asking difficult questions, nothing dramatic, just questions. Why am I pursuing this career path? Why do I believe this? Why am I afraid of that? Why does success look this way? The questions seem harmless, yet often they create tension. Not because questions are dangerous, but because questions threaten certainty. And certainty is one of the most valuable currencies in any social system. People become uncomfortable when the foundations beneath them begin to move. So the teenager learns something important. Sometimes belonging requires silence. Sometimes acceptance requires conformity. Sometimes curiosity comes with a social cost. Years pass. The teenager becomes an adult. The questions disappear, or at least they appear to disappear. But they never truly leave. They wait. They wait during sleepless nights. They wait during moments of failure. They wait during unexpected loss. They wait during success that somehow feels empty. Because eventually almost everyone reaches a moment when inherited answers stop feeling sufficient. Maybe it happens after achieving a lifelong goal and discovering fulfillment did not arrive. Maybe it happens after losing someone important. Maybe it happens during a personal crisis. Maybe it happens for no obvious reason at all. One day you wake up and realize that the map you were given does not explain the territory anymore. And that is when the deeper conflict begins. Because the problem is not merely that you may have been misled about specific ideas. The deeper problem is that you may have been misled about yourself. You may have spent years believing your value depends on productivity, or approval, or achievement, or status, or sacrifice, or perfection. You may have learned that vulnerability is weakness. You may have learned that emotions should be hidden. You may have learned that failure defines worth. You may have learned that happiness is always waiting somewhere in the future. None of these messages necessarily arrive as explicit lessons. They arrive through observation, through repetition, through subtle rewards and punishments, through watching how adults behave when nobody thinks children are paying attention. And children are always paying attention. Long before they understand words, they learn patterns. Long before they understand philosophy, they learn fear. Long before they understand identity, they begin constructing one. The most unsettling possibility is not that someone lied to you intentionally. It is that entire generations can pass down illusions without ever realizing it. A person can genuinely love you and still pass down fear. A person can genuinely care about you and still teach limitations. A person can sincerely want the best for you while unknowingly transferring unresolved wounds. This is why the issue is far more complicated than blame. It is not about villains, it is about inheritance, psychological inheritance, emotional inheritance, cultural inheritance, the transmission of assumptions from one mind to another across time. And what makes this so powerful is that inherited beliefs rarely announce themselves. They disguise themselves as common sense. They disguise themselves as normality. They disguise themselves as reality. Somewhere deep inside, however, another possibility exists. A possibility that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. What if the person you become depends less on what you were taught and more on what you eventually choose to examine? What if freedom begins not when you find all the answers, but when you develop the courage to question the answers you inherited? Most people assume the greatest danger is believing the wrong thing, but perhaps an even greater danger is never examining why you believe anything at all. And once that realization takes hold, a much larger question begins to emerge, a question that becomes impossible to ignore. If so much of your identity was shaped before you were capable of choosing it, then how much of what you call yourself today is truly yours? Imagine standing in front of a mirror and realizing that the reflection staring back at you is not entirely the person you thought it was. Not because your face has changed, not because your life has suddenly collapsed, but because you have begun noticing invisible fingerprints everywhere. Fingerprints left by years of expectations, fears, rewards, punishments, disappointments, and social conditioning. The strange thing is that this realization rarely arrives as a dramatic revelation. It usually appears quietly. It appears when you find yourself exhausted from pursuing something you supposedly wanted. It appears when you finally achieve a goal and feel nothing. It appears when you hear yourself giving advice that you do not even follow. It appears when you defend an idea and suddenly wonder whether you are defending the idea itself or merely protecting the comfort it provides. This is where the real conflict begins. Most people assume that growing older automatically means becoming more independent. But age alone does not create independence. It is possible to become older while remaining psychologically trapped inside narratives that were handed to you decades earlier. Some people spend their entire lives trying to earn approval from people who are no longer even present. Some continue chasing validation from parents who passed away years ago. Some still fear judgments that only existed inside childhood classrooms. Some organize their entire lives around avoiding rejection from communities that stopped paying attention long ago. The body grows older, the responsibilities increase, the calendar moves forward. Yet psychologically, parts of the mind can remain frozen in old stories. Think about how often fear disguises itself as logic. Someone says they cannot pursue a dream because it is unrealistic. Someone says they cannot leave an unhealthy situation because it is complicated. Someone says they cannot express what they truly think because it is not worth the trouble. Sometimes those concerns are legitimate. Reality matters. Consequences matter. Responsibility matters. But sometimes practicality becomes a mask. Sometimes what appears to be wisdom is actually fear wearing a sophisticated costume. The terrifying part is that fear rarely announces itself honestly. Fear rarely says, "I am controlling your decisions." Instead, it says, "I am protecting you." It says, "Stay where you are." It says, "Do not risk embarrassment." It says, "Do not question too much." It says, "Do not challenge the familiar." It says, "Do not examine the foundations too closely, because you might discover cracks." Over time, these messages become so familiar that they begin sounding like your own voice. That is why genuine self-examination feels uncomfortable. It forces you to separate your authentic thoughts from inherited reflexes. It forces you to distinguish caution from fear, conviction from conditioning, and identity from imitation. Somewhere along the way, many people learn another powerful lesson without realizing it. They learn that acceptance is conditional, not always openly, not always intentionally, but subtly. They learn that certain behaviors receive praise while others receive criticism. Certain emotions receive approval while others receive rejection. Certain opinions strengthen belonging while others threaten it. Eventually, a silent calculation begins taking place inside the mind. Which version of me receives love? Which version receives approval? Which version stays safe? This calculation becomes so automatic that people often mistake adaptation for authenticity. They forget where performance ends and identity begins. Have you ever noticed how different versions of yourself appear in different environments? One version around family, another around friends, another at work, another online, another when completely alone. Most people assume this is hypocrisy. Sometimes it is, but often it reveals something deeper. It reveals how profoundly social human beings are. We adapt constantly. We shift constantly. We adjust constantly. The question is not whether adaptation exists. The question is whether you still know who you are underneath it. If you have ever felt that tension between who you are and who you feel expected to be, share your experience below. Few people talk honestly about this struggle, yet it may be one of the most universal human experiences. The deeper you look, the more unsettling the pattern becomes. Entire industries profit from insecurity. Entire social systems depend upon comparison. Entire cultural narratives encourage people to evaluate themselves against impossible standards. From childhood onward, many people receive the same message in different forms. You are not enough yet, not successful enough, not attractive enough, not intelligent enough, not accomplished enough, not disciplined enough, not admired enough, not wealthy enough. The finish line keeps moving. The standard keeps changing. The goalpost keeps shifting. And because the target is always moving, satisfaction remains permanently out of reach. This creates a cycle that can last a lifetime. A person believes fulfillment exists just beyond the next achievement. They work harder. They sacrifice more. They finally reach the goal. For a brief moment, they experience relief. Then the feeling fades. A new goal appears. A new comparison emerges. A new inadequacy is identified. The cycle begins again. What if one of the greatest deceptions is not a specific lie, but an entire way of measuring human worth? What if many people have been taught to treat themselves like projects that are never finished? What if they have mistaken constant self-optimization for genuine growth? Consider how often people postpone their lives. They postpone happiness until success arrives. They postpone peace until certainty arrives. They postpone self-acceptance until perfection arrives. Yet perfection never arrives. Certainty never fully arrives. Complete control never arrives. Human life remains unpredictable, fragile, and uncertain, regardless of how much effort is invested in eliminating uncertainty. This realization can feel devastating at first, but it can also become strangely liberating. Because once you stop expecting absolute certainty, you become free to engage honestly with reality. Reality is messy. Reality contains contradictions. Reality contains unanswered questions. Reality contains complexity. One reason inherited narratives feel so attractive is because they often simplify complexity. They offer clean explanations for complicated experiences. They provide certainty where uncertainty exists. They create order where chaos feels overwhelming. The problem is not that people seek meaning. The problem is that certainty can become addictive. Once certainty becomes emotionally necessary, curiosity begins to die. Questions become threats instead of opportunities. Doubt becomes weakness instead of exploration. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Yet some of the most important moments of growth occur precisely when certainty breaks apart. Think about major turning points in life: the end of a relationship, the loss of a job, a personal failure, a painful disappointment, a crisis of identity. Rarely do these experiences feel valuable while they are happening. Usually they feel frightening. Usually they feel disorienting. Yet afterward, many people realize something unexpected. The collapse of certainty forced them to confront realities they had avoided for years. It forced them to question assumptions that no longer served them. It forced them to rebuild, not from inherited expectations, but from direct experience. This is why the journey becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Once you start questioning one assumption, others begin revealing themselves. You start noticing invisible scripts everywhere. You notice how often fear shapes decisions. You notice how often status influences judgment. You notice how often people defend familiar ideas, not because they have examined them carefully, but because those ideas help maintain psychological stability. And perhaps most disturbing of all, you begin noticing these patterns inside yourself, because the easiest illusions to recognize are the ones affecting other people. The hardest illusions to recognize are the ones shaping your own thinking. There comes a point where blaming society, culture, family, institutions, or circumstances becomes insufficient. Those influences matter. They shape everyone. But eventually, another responsibility emerges. The responsibility to examine what has been inherited. The responsibility to ask difficult questions. The responsibility to decide which beliefs deserve to remain and which deserve reconsideration. This process is not comfortable. It can feel lonely. It can create tension. It can challenge relationships. It can disrupt identities that once felt stable. Yet something remarkable begins happening when people engage honestly with these questions. They become less certain but more authentic, less rigid but more thoughtful, less dependent on borrowed answers but more capable of forming their own conclusions. And that transformation leads directly into an even more unsettling realization. Because once you understand how deeply your beliefs, fears, ambitions, and assumptions have been shaped by forces outside your awareness, another question becomes impossible to avoid. If so much of your life has been influenced by invisible stories, then what happens when you finally stop running from the possibility that some of those stories may still be controlling you today without your knowledge. Picture yourself lying awake long after everyone else has gone to sleep. The room is silent. No notifications, no conversations, no distractions. Just you and the thoughts that become louder when there is nowhere left to hide from them. Most people know this feeling. Those rare moments when the noise of everyday life finally disappears and something deeper begins asking questions that are difficult to answer. Questions that cannot be solved with entertainment. Questions that cannot be silenced with productivity. Questions that cannot be escaped through routine. In those moments, many people discover something unsettling. They realize that they have spent years moving forward without ever stopping to ask where they were actually going. They have followed paths, met expectations, pursued goals, adopted beliefs, repeated habits, and maintained identities without fully understanding why. Not because they were foolish, not because they lacked intelligence, but because momentum is powerful. Human beings are capable of living inside a story for so long that they stop noticing it is a story. And perhaps that is the deepest idea hidden beneath everything explored so far. The greatest influence over your life may not come from obvious deception. It may come from unquestioned assumptions. Assumptions so familiar that they feel invisible. Assumptions about success. Assumptions about failure. Assumptions about love. Assumptions about meaning. Assumptions about what kind of life is valuable. Assumptions about what makes a person worthy. Assumptions about what should be feared. Assumptions about what should be pursued. The strange thing about assumptions is that they often survive precisely because they remain unexamined. The moment they are exposed to honest reflection, their power begins to change. Some grow stronger because they withstand scrutiny. Others begin to collapse because they were never supported by understanding in the first place. This is why genuine self-reflection feels less like acquiring new knowledge and more like removing layers. Layer after layer of inherited certainty. Layer after layer of borrowed identity. Layer after layer of unconscious conditioning, until eventually you arrive face to face with a question that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who am I when nobody is telling me who to be? It sounds simple, it sounds almost obvious, yet it may be one of the most difficult questions a human being can ask. Because most people encounter themselves through the eyes of others. They learn who they are by observing reactions. Approval creates one image, criticism creates another. Praise creates one identity, rejection creates another. Over time, the self becomes intertwined with external feedback. This creates a fragile foundation, because if your identity depends entirely on external validation, then every criticism becomes a threat, and every rejection becomes a crisis. The world gains enormous power over your sense of self. This is one reason so many people feel trapped. They are not only carrying expectations from childhood, they are carrying expectations from co-workers, friends, family members, social groups, strangers, and cultural narratives. Everyone seems to have an opinion about what a successful life should look like. Everyone seems to have a definition of happiness. Everyone seems to have a formula for meaning. Yet the closer you examine these competing definitions, the more contradictory they become. One person says fulfillment comes through achievement. Another says it comes through simplicity. One says security matters most. Another says freedom matters most. One says belonging is essential. Another says independence is the highest virtue. The contradictions reveal something important. Human beings are searching. They are interpreting. They are trying to make sense of existence using limited information. And perhaps one of the most liberating realizations is understanding that uncertainty is not necessarily a failure. Uncertainty may be the natural consequence of confronting questions larger than ourselves. This idea becomes especially powerful when applied to personal identity. Many people secretly believe they should have everything figured out. They believe adulthood is supposed to arrive with complete clarity. They believe confidence means never doubting. They believe wisdom means always knowing. Yet reality tells a different story. Some of the most thoughtful people remain uncertain about important questions. Some of the wisest people continue questioning themselves. Some of the strongest people openly acknowledge complexity. Confidence and certainty are not the same thing. In fact, Excessive certainty can sometimes prevent growth. If you already believe you know everything worth knowing, curiosity disappears, reflection disappears, learning disappears. This brings us back to the idea that you may have been lied to since childhood. Perhaps the lie was not a specific doctrine, belief, institution, tradition, philosophy, or worldview. Perhaps the lie was the expectation that life could be reduced to simple answers. Perhaps the lie was the belief that certainty equals truth. Perhaps the lie was the promise that if you followed the correct script, asked the correct questions, avoided the wrong mistakes, and adopted the right identity, everything would eventually make perfect sense. Reality rarely operates that way. Reality is more mysterious than many people want to admit. Human beings are more contradictory than they want to admit. Motivation is more complex than it appears. Memory is less reliable than it feels. Perception is more subjective than it seems. Even our understanding of ourselves remains incomplete. Yet strangely, this realization does not have to produce despair. It can produce humility. It can produce curiosity. It can produce freedom. Because once you stop demanding absolute certainty from life, you become capable of engaging honestly with what is actually in front of you. You stop defending ideas merely because they are familiar. You stop clinging to identities merely because they are comfortable. You stop treating questions as enemies. Instead, questions become invitations, invitations to examine, invitations to understand, invitations to grow. There is a reason uncomfortable questions feel so powerful. They expose the gap between what we assume and what we know. They reveal the distance between inherited certainty and personal understanding. They remind us that being human involves navigating ambiguity rather than escaping it. If you disagree with this perspective, explain why below. If you recognize parts of your own experience in it, share that as well. Some of the most meaningful conversations begin when people honestly explore the assumptions that shape them. Because beneath every belief system, every ideology, every philosophy, every tradition, every personal identity, there exists a human being trying to make sense of existence. A human being searching for meaning, belonging, security, purpose, and understanding. And maybe that is the realization waiting at the end of this journey. Not that you should reject everything you inherited. Not that you should accept everything you inherited, but that you should examine it, carefully, honestly, courageously. Some inherited ideas may prove deeply valuable, others may no longer serve you. Some fears may be protecting you, others may be limiting you. Some assumptions may survive scrutiny, others may dissolve under it. The important thing is not arriving at perfect certainty. The important thing is refusing to live unconsciously. Because the most profound transformation rarely occurs when someone discovers a new answer. It often occurs when they finally ask a question they have been avoiding for years. And perhaps tonight, after this video ends and the distractions return and daily life continues moving forward, one question will remain. Not whether someone lied to you intentionally. Not whether every belief you hold is wrong. Not whether you should abandon everything you were taught. But something much more personal, much more difficult, much more important. If every expectation, assumption, fear, and certainty were stripped away for a moment, what would remain that genuinely belongs to you?